welcome to another edition of the Bear Market Brief podcast. I'm your host, Aaron. Our focus this episode is on the term «выборы в Государственную Думу». Now, if you don't happen to speak Russian, don't worry. That means state Duma elections, the Duma being Russia's parliament. Russia's latest elections are set to conclude on September 19th, and that being the case, we wanted to provide some context. Joining us this edition is Felix Light, a correspondent at the Moscow Times. We discussed the broader meaning of the elections, who's involved, and what we're expecting to see. If you're curious about Russian politics, this is an episode for you. So, let's dive in. Welcome to the podcast. Great to have you today.
It's great to be here. Thanks, Anne.
So we've got a pretty interesting, pertinent subject matter as far as Russia is concerned today. But before we get into the weeds here, just wanted you to quickly introduce yourself to the listeners.
I'm Felix Light. I'm a journalist at the Moscow Times, which is certainly these days the only kind of independent English language news source based in Russia. And obviously, in these last few months and weeks, I've been mostly covering the Duma elections on September the 19th, and that's been my focus, and more generally, Russian politics inside and outside of election season.
Fantastic. Well, sounds like you're the right person to talk to today. So we have these elections coming up. Let's start kind of at a top level, 30,000 feet, looking down. What do these elections mean for Russia's political system, politics broadly? What's at stake here?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and it's a one that probably I certainly sometimes overlook. But I certainly think that basically, when we talk about Russian elections, we obviously think that it's a sham, that Russia has this authoritarian politics, which is not untrue. But it's important to remember that Russia is not like a purpose-built authoritarian state. It's formally a democracy that operates in practice on authoritarian lines, and its elections are managed and choreographed and coordinated, certainly, but they're not entirely irrelevant, and they're not devoid of content. There is electoral competition, albeit from a very truncated range of parties that are very obviously carefully chosen, and not parties that are not United Russia, that are not the ruling party, do on occasion win. It's not totally unheard of. And so I think there's a certain kind of, the elections are not rotten enough that they're irrelevant. There are a great number of imperfections. There's a degree of rigging in certain places, but it is a valuable institution that shows us where Russia is at, where the Russian people are, what they think. But also, it's incredibly important, I think, for the narrow point of view of the political system, that it's a legitimation exercise. It's very important for Putin, for the Kremlin, that they should be seen to achieve strong electoral results. Putin's legitimacy does come from a quote unquote democratic mandate, albeit a deeply imperfect one. And so I think it's important from a legitimacy perspective. And that's even more important now, of course, because we don't yet know what will happen in 2024 when Putin's next on the ballot. And it will be very important in going into a presidential election year where Putin may run for office. He may not as well. That's not impossible. But the parliament should be a docile one, that it should be a carefully controlled one. And that's very, very important from the point of view of the Kremlin. But also, I think if you're talking from the perspective of, let's say, a prognosticator, the Duma will always be important because it is institutionally very important, even if it's largely been hollowed out and it's not a practical seat of power anymore where it was in the past. And so, if we were to one day wake up with no, Putin, the Duma would be incredibly important in any hypothetical transition of power in Russia. So I think we have to pay attention to it as an institution and to its elections.
So we're in kind of taking on that question, looking from the top down, maybe how Putin sees the elections, how international observers. Let's now kind of flip the script here and look at it from how Russians are seeing the elections. I guess most importantly, what is educating their current political views? What are the issues at play for them that may be determining how they're going to vote, if they're going to vote at all?
Mm-hmm. Well, so if they're going to vote at all is a huge question, because the dominant emotion, the dominant dynamic here, I think, is apathy and a sense of powerlessness on the part of the elector. I think Russia has this sort of imitation democracy, which people do participate in, but no one from the sort of the individual voter to the sort of the member of, let's say, the Communist Party particularly deludes themselves that the system is fair, right? People know that the outcome is largely preordained, if not exactly, then the sort of broad outcome. But in terms of, if we talk about the issues, I think economics, especially this time around, is hugely important. Specifically things like inflation, like rising prices. Putin personally has been talking about sort of rising food prices all year. It really has dominated. His sort of public-facing speeches that he's been giving, sort of in front of the people, quote unquote. I mean, and I think that in many ways is a little bit of a defeat for the Kremlin, because I think what they wanted to do was what they did in 2016, the last Duma election, which was essentially run it on like foreign policy, right? Run an election based on sort of, we are the guarantors of national sovereignty. So you see, if you look at the list of United Russia candidates, the top two candidates are Sergei Lavrov and Sergei Shoigu, the foreign minister and the defense minister, two very popular figures, within the Russian establishment, who are very much sort of people who speak like geopolitics, national security, these kind of anxieties. But that's not proved to be what this election is about. This election has been about bread and butter issues, economic issues, inflation, sliding incomes. But if anything, I think the single most important issue is actually one that happened 3 years ago, which is the pension reform, when there was United Russia essentially raised the pension, or the government, I should say, raised the pension age by a few years, the state pension age, and almost overnight, United Russia's polling basically halved. Like, it was an enormously controversial issue, and it is really why I think these elections and why politics over these last few years have been a bit fraught, because this kind of material kind of bargain that the Kremlin has sort of struck with the Russian people, the remnants of the Soviet welfare state, like this quite generous retirement age, were being chipped away, and people were less willing to tolerate that, especially after sort of the glow of the Crimean annexation had worn off a bit. So I think, this election in terms of issues has been really defined by the decline of foreign policy as a live issue and the rise of these domestic ones.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's true. Just for context, I think that's true in a lot of countries. This is not just a uniquely Russian phenomenon where these, high-level foreign policy issues that people in government spend so much time thinking about wind up ultimately mattering that much to average people. So let's now take a step a little closer to the issue at hand. Zoom in. So we have this universe of parties that are running, political players. So I want to ask, I guess you could call it the Sesame Street question here. Who are the people in your neighborhood? Who are competing in the election? What are the parties? What are they stands for? Do they really have meaningful platforms, given what you've mentioned about Russia's politics? Also wanted to ask a little bit more about each of these parties, kind of their base of support, be that demographic, geographic. So let's start with the supposed leader, or at least as far as the polling is concerned, but we'll talk about that in a bit. Let's start with United Russia. What is going on with United Russia? This is the systemic party, the party in power, kind of the Kremlin's party, quote unquote. What are they up to? Where do they stand? How are they doing?
Yeah, I mean, United Russia, it's almost in many ways the least interesting of the lot, because it is in the purest sense like a party of power. Like, it's the party of the status quo. It's the party who is sort of definitionally is in power, and it probably wouldn't exist if it wasn't in power. We see in sort of regions of Russia where it actually loses power, it actually very swiftly sort of collapses almost, and sort of people, local power brokers will move to a new center of influence. So I mean, it's broadly, I suppose, a right-wing party, a center-right party, but that is it's a very relative term because of the Russian political system being so odd. Certainly relative to the other parties, it is consistently probably the most sensible sounding party, because it is not sort of, it's not a communist party, it's not an ultra-nationalist party, it's a party of sort of managers, a party of sort of administrators, a party of bureaucrats. Around election time, you'll get sort of more populist measures. You'll get things like 10,000 rubles for teachers, and 15,000 for soldiers, and things like this. But ideologically, it's very much defined by the sort of the fashion in the Kremlin, I think, more than anything. But it's the ruling party. It will find it very difficult to lose. It's very unpopular at the moment. It's polling sort of perhaps somewhere between 25 and 30 in most polls, which is pretty dismal, considering this is a party that took 54% of the vote in 2016. It's the party of Vladimir Putin, but Vladimir Putin's personal popularity, which is very real, very genuine, and very broad, does not traditionally translate to United Russia, because United Russia is, in the popular imagination, dominated and characterized by this sort of very unattractive cast of lower level officials who are variously sort of corrupt, neglectful, abusive, and so it does. You don't get United Russia ever sort of performing to the level that Putin himself personally does, which is why why Putin doesn't like to particularly associate himself with United Russia, but also when every sort of Duma election runs around, you find him going out on the stump because the party needs him and it relies on his sort of personal clout and personal popularity.
So if United Russia had a political base, I know there's reputational issues right now. Who does vote for United Russia? Like, what would motivate someone to vote for this party specifically? And is there any particular geography to it? And I want to keep honing back in on the geography because I think it's worth noting. Again, our angle here on the podcast is that Russia is a real country and real countries have real political geography. So who is the kind of archetypal United Russia voter?
Well, the archetypal United Russia voter is a public sector worker or a retired public sector worker more generally, because turnout is very low in Russian elections and turnout is very heavily slanted towards the retired and the elderly. Generally, United Russia, if we want to talk in geographical terms, is strongest in rural areas and perhaps in sort of European Russia outside the big cities, we could say. It does very well in the south of Russia, this kind of region, Krasnodar region, which is kind of booming, these kind of very prosperous regions, maybe, a handful of places that have really sort of benefited, unambiguously from the Putin years, where life has sort of tangibly got better. But, there's only so much you can sort of read into it because it is the dominant party. It will always it wins a majority in every given region. And when we talk about sort of where it's weak, where it's strong, we're talking relatively. You could generally say United Russia is noticeably weaker in the big cities, particularly in Moscow and to a lesser extent in St. Petersburg. It is also generally a little bit weaker in the Far East. The Far East of Russia is a very sort of protest-orientated region, not in like the Navalny sense, but in the sense towards the systemic parties, it leans quite strongly. United Russia also does extremely well in the sort of ethnic minority republics, so Tatarstan and Bashkortostan on the Volga, and also the North Caucasian republics. In Chechnya, it will get 98% of the vote on a 95% turnout, something like that. But naturally, as you might imagine, this is not because of authentic support. This is largely because sort of local, sort of national ethnic elites in these regions have sort of understandings with the Kremlin that they get a degree of autonomy in return for providing for the political loyalty of their republics, or so it seems. So these are the kind of places where United Russia's sort of vote share, even if it's kind of lackluster nationally, will be propped up. It will get these strong votes in places like Tuva, in places like Dagestan, in places like Tatarstan again. So in terms of geography, I think that if there's an opposition, if there's an anti-United Russia area, it's very much Moscow and the Far East.
So let's now turn to the second set of players, although I think it is worth addressing them individually within this broader group. So we have the systemic opposition. And in the field, when we say that, we mean the quote unquote opposition parties that are essentially allowed to exist and play a political role by the Kremlin. And that would include the Communist Party of Russia, would include the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, arguable whether it's liberal or democratic, but we'll get there. And a couple of other parties. There's a Just Russia. There's a new one, New People. Let's talk about this set of parties. I guess we'll start on the top level, the kind of broad mandate, like why they exist, what they exist for. And then we'll talk about individually kind of the dynamics that may or may not separate them.
Yeah, so from the point of view of the Kremlin, Russia is not a single party state. It has a bunch of sort of opposition parties who are permitted to compete on an uneven electoral playing field, but they could conceivably win elections, and on some levels they do. They have a consistent representation in the state Duma, even though they almost by definition cannot be in the majority. They also sometimes win governor elections, especially since this pension reform that made United Russia very unpopular, and they're quite well represented at the local level. These parties, there's a very popular sort of explanation of them, which is essentially that they're fake opposition. And I don't really like that explanation because, who's going to go into politics just because you're to basically professionally lose to United Russia? People go in for their own reasons, and some of these people sort of have ideological convictions. Some of them want to be in public office because it's a nice way to earn a good living and sort of have the perks of office. But I think what marks these people out and why they're different from someone like Navalny is that they basically, to a greater or lesser extent, are reconciled to the reality of a political system where Vladimir Putin is the main player and that United Russia, to a lesser extent, is the dominant party, and that for the foreseeable future, they will not win the grand prize. They will not be the government, but they can have a role in the system, and they can provide a voice for their certain ideals, and they can, of course, use it as a comfortable career sort of trajectory as well. And so this is, I think, that's the broad sort of logic, I think, of the systemic opposition. Now, systemicness is kind of a sort of a spectrum more than a sort of absolute term, right? So I think the communists, the largest party, are clearly the least systemic of the main parties. They are the most independent. They're the most sort of ideological. They're the most committed to a sort of an alternative vision of what Russia ought to be. And the other parties are substantially more sort of, less committed, shall we say, to their own ideological visions and much more okay with basically a Putin-dominated political system. But it's a game of sort of ambiguities, I think. Here.
So starting with the communists, and I think is worth noting, does have a pretty significant political infrastructure. And again, I think your point that these are not fake parties really resonates. That the communists have the ability to turn out people, turn out protesters, if need be. The question is always, to what extent are they allowed to do real opposition? But let's talk about, I think it's clear what they generally stand for. You can tell by the name. But who supports them? Where do they have their support?
The stereotype of the Communist Party was always that it's like the party of the sort of the nostalgic voter, the rural voter, maybe like the industrial worker in, Chelyabinsk or something. But actually, I think that's a little bit of flux right now, simply because that generation of people is obviously, fading away. There are fewer of those voters. And obviously, the communists are a party in long-term decline. In the 90s against Yeltsin, they made a very real play for power. Now they're a sort of a party of between 10, 15, 20%, basically. That's their ballpark. But their electorate is kind of in flux because even though the party is dominated at the highest levels by people who are, reflective of this kind of Soviet nostalgic mindset, of this Soviet nostalgic sort of almost subculture, a lot of their lower level officials, so like regional deputies and sort of regional Dumas, are very radical, are often very sort of have certain links with like the Navalny movement, which is the non-systemic opposition, which is the one that sort of isn't considered legitimate by the Kremlin. And it's reflected in their voter base as well. So, the communists in the 90s against Yeltsin always did very badly in Moscow because it was the most liberal, sort of richest part of the country. Now the communists do very, very well in Moscow relative to the rest of the country because they are seen as the most real of the sort of tolerated opposition parties. And so if you're a sort of, a Navalny supporter in Moscow who wants to sort of stick it to United Russia, then your most obvious bet is the Communist Party. You're most likely to receive a sort of a credible, independent, sort of, authentic opposition deputy by voting for the Communist Party. So the communists generally do very well in Moscow. They do quite well in St. Petersburg as well. They have a handful, perhaps, of these kind of old, like what we used to call the Red Belt strongholds. So, like, Ulyanovsk, where Lenin was born, is a big communist stronghold. Tolyatti, an industrial city on the Volga, very big communist stronghold. But I mean, the communists, because a certain stripe of the population that's really kind of nationwide does have these sort of like communist, nostalgic beliefs. Almost anywhere, any given place in Russia, you can reliably see them getting like 10%. It's just in a few places they get a bit more than that. And yeah.
We'll be right back after this short break.
B&B Russia is meant for anyone who wants to understand what is going on in the world of politics and economics in one of the world's key emerging markets, or perhaps just wants a peek into the broader post-Soviet space. We're a team dedicated to making Russia and Eurasia more accessible, both to rising area experts and specialists, but also to those who don't know what kvass is, have no strong opinions about dill, and don't have any feelings about Moscow's macroeconomic policies. We're here to keep you ahead of the curve and spot what most in English language media aren't talking about. The B&B Russia project is led by FPRI fellow and B&B editor-in-chief Stephanie Petrella, while our latest edition, B&B Ukraine, is led by FPRI associate scholar Eilish Hart. To receive the latest on Russia and Ukraine news, be sure to sign up for BNB Russia at www.fpri.org/subscribe. And now back to the discussion.
Let's turn to the next player here, and I mentioned the Liberal Democratic Party. So, as I mentioned before, not necessarily liberal by any stretch of the imagination, and not particularly democratic either. Their leader is a bit of a firebrand, to say the very, very least. Tell us about them, kind of what the platform is and where they gain support.
Yeah, so it's sort of like the Liberal Democratic Party is probably the most spectacularly misnamed party in sort of human history. If one were to sort of apply a sort of easy ideological sort of descriptor to it, would be sort of ultranationalist, far right. Sort of Russia for the ethnic Russians. Sort of against immigration for sort of, but also at the same time for sort of reconstructing the Soviet Union by sort of annexation. Sort of very up for sort of an aggressive foreign policy, at least in practice. I think though, and of course the leader Vladimir Zhirinovsky is a sort of like he's a tried and tested sort of performance artist of politics. He has quite an extraordinary sort of mannerism to him. He's charismatic in a sort of very strange and off-putting way. But obviously we are probably not his audience, but he remains 30 years after his political debut like one of the most popular political figures in Russia. Like the communist leader Zyuganov has a minimal public sort of following, but in any given poll you'll consistently see like sort of Vladimir Zhirinovsky getting 10% of the population saying he's the person they trust most. He's got a sort of a base, and that's a base that I think is sort of basically most understood as a sort of less as a sort of a party of sort of, or a base of sort of far right nationalism, as a sort of like against all section of the population. The party itself, it's I think it's problematic to say it's a sort of narrowly it's a fascist party or a far right party, because fundamentally it's a very incoherent party. Zhirinovsky has a broad worldview, but he can also be for all kinds of strange things, like that you can't really predict. He is, in that sense, his party is probably of all the parties is most explicitly sort of about rents, about sort of providing an opportunity to sort of extract rent from the system. It's very famous for selling seats, in the Duma to sort of businessmen who want sort of, let's say, immunity from prosecution or lobbying rights and things like that. So, it's hard to generalize about the LDPR at large. It's by no means do all of the LDPR supporters sort of subscribe to like the Zhirinovsky philosophy. In general, though, it does very well in the Far East. It's basically the reason why the United Russia do very poorly in the Far East, or relatively poorly. Of course, 2 years ago, or last year actually, we had the story of Sergei Furgal, who was the governor of Khabarovsk, an LDPR guy, who was jailed eventually, on sort of historic murder charges, and many sort of associated that with the idea that he'd been sort of he'd upset United Russia where he shouldn't have done. And, this is very much the position of the LDPR, a sort of like when people are angry, they vote for the LDPR. It's a sort of like a cry of sort of incoherent sort of screw the system anger, basically.
So there are a couple other systemic parties. Just wanted to ask about them. We have a Just Russia, a couple others. Are they meaningful players, or are they more just add some spice to people's, options when they go to the ballot box?
Yeah, I mean, a Just Russia is not insignificant. It has something like 25 deputies in the Duma, but at the same time, like it's a very systemic party. It was conceived as like the sort of the left wing pro Putin party as opposed to the right wing pro Putin party. It's never really worked. It's dependent on a few people who have strong followings in their districts or in their local regions, who will sort of get re-elected on its ticket. It has a very weak national identity, and I think certainly more recently, the Kremlin has always been casting around for like a way to give it life, and what they've sort of settled on is that they sort of got a guy called Zakhar Prilepin, who's a sort of an ultra-nationalist novelist involved, who's reinvented it in a sort of a way that, like, we're economically on the left, we're sort of social democrats, but also we're very hardline on like the Donbass issue, and we're for sort of the annexation of the Donbass and this kind of thing. So it's a sort of it's wound up today as a sort of left nationalist party. It's certainly, I think, a less interesting player than the other two.
Makes sense. Now let's turn our lens again to the non-systemic opposition, the opposition. Now, Navalny's currently in jail. There's been efforts to essentially sideline any of this. Well, it's not really a particular party, but sideline any of these members of the movement from having any meaningful role in politics, not even winning, but like running to begin with. So do we expect the non-systemic opposition to have any meaningful role in this election as far as garnering support, even getting candidates onto the ballot? Where do they stand? And this could be a podcast episode in itself.
So I'll try and be concise. Basically, look, I think the thing to bear in mind here is the dividing line between the systemic and the non-systemic opposition is not absolute. There are a number of sort of people, who ran on the line of the Communist Party or Yabloko, which is a sort of like very small, very old liberal party, which still has ballot access, who were sort of identified as like non-systemic players and removed from the ballot. We had a guy called Pavel Grudinin, who was the Communist Party candidate in 2018, who's been just banned from running because he's seen as excessively non-systemic, excessively sort of prone to independence. If we talk, about Navalny now, again, like it's really difficult because Navalny's whole sort of thing, this smart voting strategy, which is where he basically says, in every sort of district, we will identify the sort of the party, the candidate who is best placed to defeat United Russia. But of course, the only people who are allowed to run are the systemic opposition, the communists, the LDPR, and Just Russia. So there's sort of the two have quite a tight interplay. In the next few weeks, we'll see Navalny's team, of course, in exile, dropping these recommendations. Most of them will go to the communists because they're, as I say, the largest and the most independent party. But the two's kind of fate is intertwined, certainly because if the communists do well at this election, which seems quite likely because of the issue profile, being about socioeconomic issues, which the communists do traditionally well on, the Navalny campaign will claim that as a victory. That may not be fair, but they will claim it as a victory. If we talk like in narrow terms, sort of about the Navalny organization, it's smashed. I think at the moment it's very insignificant. It's not a substantial a substantial electoral player on its own. It's their people are basically barred from running for office by the new anti-extremism law. And so their influence on politics, or at least in electoral politics, is sort of it's vicarious. It's through the communists. It's through the LDPR in some cases. And so the two's fate really hangs together, I think, in this month.
So let's turn to our final topic now, which is what to expect. But I wanted to ask here. So I see kind of a dissonance in two current trends. So on one hand, you mentioned at the beginning that this election, if you're looking at the top down from kind of the Kremlin's perspective, is about establishing a stable foundation for Putin to do whatever he decides to do in 2024. So winning stability, predictability, controllability, kind of eliminating the Duma, it sounds like, as a variable that could meaningfully be unpredictable and impact Putin's decision making. On the other hand, and I think the Kremlin's well aware of this, United Russia is not particularly popular right now. People are in pain and frustrated. They may be apathetic, but the economy in Russia has not done well since about Crimea, hasn't really grown meaningfully, especially as far as your disposable income and actual people's money. So how is the Kremlin going to, I guess that's the $1 million question here, how does the Kremlin balance the need to demonstrate that the people are unhappy with the kind of countervailing need to make a predictable system?
Yeah, so they need to be able to show that the system has the sort of the lack of the sort of the flexibility to display sort of dissent. Yeah, I totally agree. Well, one response would be that they just don't do that because they rely, to this point, sort of on the strength of the security service, on the strength of repression. They've travelled so far away from the sort of the managed democracy as it was had in sort of the 2000s that they just abandon the pretense of doing that in the first place and just rig the election spectacularly for United Russia. That's possible. We have things like 3-day voting and early voting, and anecdotal evidence suggests that they are basically very convenient tools to rig elections, in the Russian context, I should say. On the other hand, I think that they've done such a good job, I think, of weeding out any potentially sort of unreliable figures from the candidate list, specifically of the Communist Party, that they can probably allow the communists to gain maybe 10, 20, or even 30 seats. Because that would probably still leave United Russia with the vast bulk of seats. Even if, United Russia is getting a quarter of the electorate to vote for it, it will still benefit from things like rigging, in certain areas of the country. Chechnya, we mentioned before, of course. It will benefit from what is called the administrative resource, which is basically the way state employees are compelled one way or another to cast their ballots, usually for United Russia. It will benefit from overwhelmingly positive media coverage, which will get it the percentage it needs. It will get that percentage. And just for the record, the percentage it wants and the percentage it needs is what they call a constitutional majority, a 2/3 majority of seats in the Duma. You can get that on like 40% of the vote. So, it's very possible that they will achieve what they need in terms of control of the Duma on a substantially diminished vote share. And I think as long as that substantially diminished vote share didn't elect particularly radical figures, that would be fine from the perspective of the Kremlin. I think there's an expectation that probably United Russia should be the lead party, but doesn't have to be the absolute hegemonic one, and its vote share can be allowed to oscillate. It has in the past. And so I think that's a fairly substantially likely outcome. A reduced vote share for United Russia, some loss of seats, but not one that ultimately threatens its overwhelmingly dominant position in Parliament.
So you'd say that would be your prediction?
Yeah, I think so. I don't think like there are any. I obviously for my job I talk to a lot of sort of political scientists, political observers in Russia, and I can't think of anyone who would seriously predict as the baseline outcome as anything other than another United Russia 2/3 majority as a result of sort of rigging, as a result of being very careful about who they allowed to contest the ballot, and I think that's the baseline scenario.
So there you have it. Felix, thank you for joining us today.
I'm glad to be here.
Thanks again to Felix, and thanks to you, listener, for tuning in. Don't forget to follow BMB Russia and Eurasia at the Twitter handle @BearMarketBrief. BMB Russia and Eurasia is a project of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, that's FPRI, a nonpartisan think tank. For more information about this initiative and others, be sure to visit fpri.org. We'll catch you next time.